Hi, everyone. We are going to get started quite soon with our final panel, Neurotechnology and Religion. Let me introduce our three panelists. Our first panelist is James Hughes from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. James is a sociologist, bioethicist, and futurist. He's the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and senior research fellow at the University of Massachusetts Boston's Applied Ethics Center. Hughes holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Chicago, where he served as the assistant director of research for the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics. He's co-host of the Prosthetic Gods podcast with AEC's Nir Isakovitz. We also have Seth Villegas of Boston University. Seth is a lecturer, Dr. Villegas, is a lecturer in the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences. Seth is a philosopher whose main specialization is in technological ethics. His work is naturally interdisciplinary and collaborative, connecting him to several different parts of the university. He's guest lectured in many computer science and data science courses, and he hopes that his work can help students to resolve potential ethical dilemmas and to navigate future challenges after graduation. He received a PhD in theological studies from Boston University. And our final speaker is Daniel Munro from Boston University. Daniel is an assistant professor of philosophy at Boston University, interested in applying tools from philosophy of mind and epistemology to help us better understand complex phenomena such as religious cognition, artificial intelligence, and conspiracy theorizing. Dr. Munro has a PhD from Toronto University. Okay, let's welcome our first speaker.
Thanks for hanging in, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. So this one's a little bit more evangelical in terms of Buddhist evangelicalism, as you'll see in a second. The sovereign soul is the intuition most of us carry about ourselves, that there is a stable, bounded me behind the eyes, a captain at the wheel. Brain-computer interfaces, I will argue, threaten that intuition. Ethicists often frame concerns about brain-computer interfaces around the purported threats to our autonomy, our agency, to who we fundamentally are. But I want to argue that the threat is actually a liberation, and that we can reframe BCIs as the next step in our coevolution with minds. This is from a Pew survey that was done, I think, about a decade ago about desirability of brain-computer interfaces. And the Pew research shows that Americans in general still don't like the idea of brain chips in the abstract and suspect that they will have negative consequences for society. However, they do support therapeutic applications, which is the only thing that's currently on the table, although my talk will wax lyrical about future post-human possibility. However, about a quarter of Americans are fine with brain-computer interfaces for eventual consumer use, for cognitive enhancement, or entertainment purposes. And these enthusiasts tend to be secular, well-educated, and male. But another thing that is correlated with attitudes towards BCIs and other technologies is religiosity. The more religious, the less support for brain-computer interfaces. And for me, this opposition of the religious to BCIs is a bit of a mystery, since one would expect that if you believe, as most Christian Americans do, in the immaterial substance of a soul, one would think that that would be immune to being interfered with by something as mundane as a chip in the head. On the other hand, this opposition, I think, is more intelligible if neurotechnology threatens the perception that religious people have of an immutable personal identity, like gender transition or radical life extension, which also give people control over aspects of self that are presumed to be God-given verities. The integration of machines with our cognition opens us to the possibility that this persistent autonomous self is an illusion. There is a widespread anxiety today, which I think is continuous with this issue about BCIs, that the use of LLMs to manage our lives and write our term papers and make our PowerPoint slide decks is atrophying critical cognitive skills. Consumer BCIs suggest a growing reliance on the capabilities of onboard computing, accelerating the atrophy of skills that would otherwise be embedded in the meat. When paralyzed Neuralink recipient Roland Arberg moved a chess piece with his thoughts, it raised the question for observers: who performed the act? Where does the agent end and the tool begin? The BCIs don't just restore function, they fundamentally challenge our intuitions about agency and responsibility. Much of our anxiety about brain implants seems to stem from this view of the self as this indivisible entity, a pilot steering the body's machinery. In fact, I will argue that this is something that we're already deconstructing both philosophically and through neuroscience, but I'll start with the Buddhist tradition. In Buddhism, the self is a fundamental illusion that causes us our suffering. I will go on to mention Hume, who, well, I'll just talk about here, the self. For Buddhists, the self illusion comes about through the interaction of a series of bundles: our form, our body, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. They create an illusion of continuity, an illusion of autonomy, and this illusion leads to grasping, and this grasping is the source of our suffering. So for Buddhism, it is a central tenet that letting go of this grasping and this false ontology of the self is liberating. Hume similarly argued when he looked inward that he stumbled upon specific perceptions, heat and cold, light or shade, but he never caught the self without a perception. In Hume's reductionism, the mind is merely a theater where perceptions successively make their appearance. There is no underlying substance holding them together. Derek Parfit began to work on this idea and tried to create moral theory on this basis, that the personal identity is not a further fact. Instead, what matters is this probabilistic connection between our current self and the memories that we have of ourself in the future. We're a chain of overlapping memories, intentions, and beliefs over time. And for this Parfitian paradigm shift, the person that you are today is already a different person than who you were 10 years ago. And finally, I would say that cognitive neuroscience in general now frames the self as just a predictive model, the brain's best ongoing guess about what kind of agent it is and what the world expects of it. The phenomenal sense is that being someone is neither a discovery nor a given, but a construction, an ongoing construction that we're engaged in, generated out of sensory data and memory. You are the brain's most elaborate hallucination. And the connection I want to make between these deconstructive or reductionist approaches to self and personal identity is to the theory of Andy Clark and Chalmers and others of the extended mind. The notion that if you take seriously the plasticity of the self, that the self can be reconstructed any way we like, that technologies, they would argue, are already part of our selfing process. If an Alzheimer's patient relies on a notebook for memory, the notebook itself plays an exact functional role of biological memory in the cognitive process. It becomes part of our mind. Consequently, a BCI could be seen in this context as simply a more tightly integrated prop in our already extended cognitive system and could be incorporated into our phenomenology as a part of the self. So our folk psychology defines identity as this permanent essence stopping at the skull, and conversely, the reductionist or constructivist approach I want to propose says that identity is dynamic, impermanent process that extends into our environments and tools and distributes memory and agency. And so from this point of view, the BCI is not an invasion, but rather a novel reconfiguration of the already fluid and networked mind. We are searching for this rigid core self, but in fact, the process of phenomenology of existence is an ongoing process of selfing. So again, Buddhism teaches that this suffering results from the clinging to this illusion of a permanent, unchanging self. And when we apply this to neurotechnology, we can see that trying to fiercely defend this boundary between biology and technology is precisely what gives many patients their sense of self-estrangement. They They're feeling that they are no longer in control. And it also gives ethicists this pause about where does the self, where does agency really rest? Is it the real me, or is it just the machine? But I want to argue that on these grounds, BCIs are not a threat, but in fact a redistribution of agency. They widen the radius of the predictive loop, delegating specific cognitive and motor tasks to a silicon substrate. And that they may in fact then have phenomenological consequences. We may not have access to the understanding what's happening on our behalf through our machine delegation as we do with meat, but also we forget a lot of what happens with our meat. But adaptive brain, let's see, is this the adaptive brain stimulation is an example of where this is already occurring in architecture. Adaptive brain, deep brain stimulation monitors neural activity and adjusts stimulation automatically, creating a genuine shared control between device and agent, a genuine new architecture for this kind of co-agency of personhood. So I would argue that we're already grappling towards the kind of shared, expanded sense of selfing that I think Buddhism would argue for. Now, it's fascinating to me that Michael Crichton, one of his very first novels was The Terminal Man, and it was based on early brain-computer interface, deep brain stimulation, really to short-circuit seizures. And in the case of that he elaborates in this novel, the person learns that the short-circuiting the seizures with his BCI, his deep brain stimulator, is causing him pleasure, and so he gets addicted to the pleasurable feedback from it, and it causes him to eventually become a murderous monster. As with all of Michael Crichton's Luddite work, it's taking the worst possible scenario. But he was inspired by research, of course, on rodents that had implants, deep brain stimulation in pleasure parts of the brain, and that were pressing the lever instead of eating food, that they enjoyed the mental stimulation from this deep brain stimulator. And I think that this is a general case of dopamine hacking that we're worried about with social media and potentially with sycophantic AI and so forth, that we don't want the offloading or the incorporation of these technologies into our brains to give us new addictions, new distractions that take us away from our virtuous obligations or the development of our cognitive faculties. And so wireheading addiction, I think, would also be, for Buddhism, one of the 5 precepts, of behavioral precepts for lay people is not to indulge in intoxicants. So in this case, a mental intoxicant through a BCI, an external BCI or social media is as problematic as the grasping of the self in the first place. But I want to argue here also that if we think about BCIs, and I have a paper, if you're interested, you can find it on ResearchNet, a paper about the use of BCIs for moral enhancement. And I want to argue that moral enhancements also could provide us with the opportunity to control various of our addictions and vices, to become more compassionate people, to exercise more fairness. BCIs are a technology that could be much more specific in their effects than pharmaceutical approaches to moral enhancement. And so this would be the kind of counter to the addictive potentials of wireheading, of pleasure addiction through BCIs, is that we would use them, we would program them to be our better angels on our shoulder. By the way, when I was driving here yesterday and I asked my Android Auto to give me some details about the history of BCIs that I wanted to use in my opening remarks, it said, here's the date that you were looking for, but you're driving, so you really shouldn't be talking to me right now about this. You should be focused until you get to your location. I want more of that. I want my Google Health to tell me to get extra steps. I want the moral enhancement angel on my shoulder from my AI agents. So I would say that rejecting the idea of ontological existence of the self doesn't mean that there is no concern about respecting the integrity of the selfing process. And rather, I would argue that we should try to focus on vigilance about the autonomy and the integrity of our mental processes, and the BCIs could help with that. It could help us detect when it could be like an internal spam filter to detect when we're being unduly influenced by corporate or governmental influences. And here I've dropped these references, science fiction references, but there's an episode of Black Mirror where people who have BCIs start spewing advertising because it's only at the top tier that you have an advertising free BCI, and they're situation specific and they don't even know that they're doing it, so it's really horrific. There's another Black Mirror episode about soldiers getting BCIs that make them see domestic combatants, human combatants, as if they're aliens, and so they don't have any compunction about killing them. So we would want, of course, the architectures of the BCIs, the software, to be free from these kinds of influences, and also hopefully for BCIs to give us more insight into the constraints on our own cognitive liberty, so that we would be able to become more, to have enact more autonomy in our thinking. So rather than seeing the eventual uses of BCIs as dystopian, we should correctly extend our ongoing attempts to control our relationship to social media and AI into our skulls. We must demand design transparency, robust encryption, and new legal frameworks that explicitly recognize the rights of this extended human digital entity. As Dan Dennett observed, you are not out of the loop, you are the loop. You are not an extensionless point. Brain-computer interfaces do not threaten our souls because we are not static objects waiting to be invaded. We are dynamic processes of self-construction. BCIs can make us more transparent and governable, depending on the political choices that we make now. Democratic oversight and cognitive rights should aim not to protect us from BCIs, but to design BCIs that allow us to govern and protect ourselves. Thanks so much.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Seth Villegas. It's great to join all of you today. I want to talk a little bit about this quest for authentic religious experience. I do kind of mean something broader. Probably should have used the word like spiritual here, not necessarily talking about things that are institutional. But I wanted to first kind of acknowledge the kind of history of the neuroscience of religious experience and the kind of different interpretations of it. There is, of course, this kind of strand, especially of evangelical Christians, who basically say, look, like we've investigated our minds, and the fact that we're capable of God experiences is part of our design, right? Like it makes complete sense that we have these parts of our brain that would, kind of light up when we have this sort of God sensation, and therefore it affirms what it is that we believe. And if you look this up online, you'll certainly see people like this Egno neurosurgeon guy who's talking about it. But there's this other strain which basically says, well, there's an evolutionary accident to the ways that our brains have come together. We have this hyperactive agency detection, right? We see things that aren't there, the faces in the clouds sort of thing. And thus we can use our understanding of neuroscience to kind of explain away these sorts of sensations that people have. So there's a very big interpretive difference here. And then there's kind of this more agnostic path, which we'd start first with like William James, who basically looked into lots of supernatural phenomena, but didn't try to necessarily comment on the supernatural, though he did interestingly go to a lot of seances and things like that and probably debunk them, much to the chagrin of the people who were there. But a more recent example would be someone like Newberg, who does lots of these things as well. So with these sorts of technologies, we might then think, what would they actually look like? Well, on the left here, we have Shinzen Young, who was a PhD in Buddhist studies. He actually spent some time as a monk because they would not teach him about Buddhism without him putting some skin in the game, so to speak. And so as a result of that, he became practiced, and he had this idea that he did with Jay Sanguinetti to develop a helmet that might help you to get into a meditative state of mind. In other words, there's a certain kind of brain state that looks more like what you're trying to go for, right? Maybe an emptiness of mind or something like that. And so there was a thought that perhaps we can kind of shrink this down into a product now available on Amazon, not sponsored segment, right, called the Zendo, $229 if you're interested. that might be able to get you into this same state. Now, an important part of this is we want to be very careful about the types of waves that we're using. So we don't necessarily want to do things that might cause permanent damage to you, but they're specifically going to be using ultrasound waves and things like that. So because this is an Amazon product, of course, if we're going to get data about this sort of thing, it might be good to look at some of the Amazon reviews. Now, there's not tons of ratings, but it's interesting because the sorts of things that you see within this, especially if we look at this first review, the sorts of comments that we're seeing are not necessarily about like, hey, this product does not necessarily work for me, but is more related to the type of apparatus that it is. In other words, these are sort of comments that you might get about a phone or something like that, right? About like, it's a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe you don't like how much battery life there is or something like that. But there's a complete kind of acceptance that this sort of product is something that's going to be useful, and it should be noted for that lots of Shinzen Young's work and the research on it, it showed that people who are already practiced within meditation tend to be able to use products like this the best, which is to say they know the type of brain state, the meditative state that they're trying to get into, and thus perhaps this kind of product would help them to get into that. Now there's an underlying hypothesis to this, which is, can we actually get someone who has almost no meditative experience to also enter into the same sort of brain state as someone who's practiced for 25 to 30 years? Maybe not, but it is just curious that we see these things. And again, there's even a comparison to a meditation app or something like that. And so we can be kind of struck by how mundane this really is. Now, of course, we do have people, and this is a small YouTuber, one of those reviews I was able to find of this called Zen Confidential, who has this pretty interesting video, which has a pretty scathing review of what Shinzen Young's kind of research program is, which is to say, how is it that you can try to use technology in order to short circuit what should otherwise be a part of this authentic religious quest, right, to pursue some form of enlightenment. In other words, the desire to use a technology within the place of this quest is somehow out of bounds, right? It's not something that we should be using. There's something that's kind of circumventing what should be the normal process here. And we see this in lots of other places as well. So I want to highlight then some criteria for evaluating authenticity, and these are going to come from a book called Spirit Tech from some of my colleagues at BU, Wildman and Stockley, who talk specifically about the qualities of the experience, including the feelings, contents, imagery, sensations, and messages revealed in the experience, the effects of the experience has had on the person's self-understanding, behavior, physical well-being, mental health, life, meaning, community, and the causes of the experience. Now, these are very useful, and these were developed in part through empirical kind of qualitative research, just sitting down and talking to people and asking them, what do you think actually makes for a real religious experience? What are the things that cause for it? So some of those could be related to the sorts of things that you saw, right? Did you feel like you had a come to Jesus moment, right? Because you saw God directly. It could be that perhaps your life changed, perhaps you were motivated to kick a habit or something like that. But then the last thing here is specifically, what is it that's generating it? And with BCIs and other kinds of technologies like this, people get very hung up on this very much in the way that Zen Confidential does. And so to kind of move a little bit away from just Buddhism, I do think it's important to acknowledge other experiments within this area. Now, there's this famous experiment with this thing called the God helmet by Michael Persinger, in which you would basically put on this sort of contraption, which is looks kind of like a motorcycle helmet, so to speak, and we could do some sort of transcranial stimulation using magnetic waves. Now, unfortunately, this experiment was attempted to be replicated several times, and they were never able to get it to actually create this sort of God sensation that people have. If you actually look at the methodology, it seems like the sensory deprivation might have actually been a bigger factor, that there's a lot of placebo effect that's going on here. But also, unfortunately, the amount of stimulation that was actually occurring was not enough to directly affect the brain. So there's no way that it could have worked, and it never repeated. Perhaps this says something about the way in which our circumstances can start to generate these kinds of experiences. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with like Hillsong United or something like that. They're very good at evoking this sort of emotive atmosphere. You can start to believe that perhaps this is a big part of what generates these God experiences. But what's important, though, is even though this was called the God helmet, it's a little bit of a misnomer because what they experienced was not necessarily God, so to speak, but the presence of another person. And there's kind of a cultural determinant here, right? It could be a ghost, it could be a lost family member, it could be all these sorts of things. And in fact, we see how culturally determined this actually is if you do these sorts of experiments in other parts of the world. So I want to mention here that within sort of the Christian world, there are sort of these technologies of spiritual enhancement, right, if we're going to think about that. And the first and foremost one of those is books, right? You'd be amazed at how big Christian bookstores are, how important they are for actually practicing the religion. And so you could see things like this very 90s cover, Connecting with God, right? About, how is it that we maintain these sorts of experiences? Well, part of how you might do that is to actually just go out and to listen to other people. But there's this other domain of religious experience that's actually potentially dangerous, even within the sort of evangelical Christian world. And so I would like to mention to you something about Pentecostalism. Now, Pentecostalism is known for these kinds of radical experiences in which people do things that other Christian groups actually say is potentially heretical. So some of those things might be glossolalia, right, speaking in tongues, but also this kind of radical experience, which I have here on the right, which is called being slain in the Spirit. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this term, but what it basically refers to is this sensation in which someone is so overwhelmed by their feeling of God that they actually kind of faint. They keel over and they're not able to get up for a little bit. Now, I think that this is extraordinarily fascinating in the conversation of BCIs, because if we're thinking about specific brain states, these sorts of fruits of the Spirit within the Pentecostal tradition of being slain in the Spirit or being able to speak in tongues seem to be speaking to these sorts of unique brain states that even other Christian traditions are a little bit scared of. But if you can see the rise of Pentecostalism within Latin America, I think it's something we should certainly pay attention to, because it could be the case, and this is kind of a little hypothesis for you here, that there could be branches of Christianity that are open to BCIs because they have these sorts of experiences that only a select few people are allowed to have. In other words, if you were to go into a Pentecostal community and there was a specific person who had never spoken in tongues or something like that, it can actually be a bit embarrassing. Now, this is kind of strange for us to talk about here. It's attached to academics. But there's a whole culture within here of how do we get into these unique states in which we can experience these things, because it seems to only happen to a select few. So I want to make a bit of a distinction here then. If we're to think big picture about spirit tech, and what are the kind of fundamental distinction between, say, a Buddhist approach, which we just heard from Dr. Hughes before, and a kind of Christian approach, where is the biggest difference in these things? The most important one is that these sort of desired spiritual experience within most Buddhist traditions is usually going to be the goal, which is to say, we're looking for that brain state, and however we can stay in that brain state for as long as possible is what we're looking for. The Dalai Lama spoke at a neuroscience conference almost a decade ago and basically said, if there was some way in which we could enter into that state through a BCI, into this sort of, painless state in which we're kind of absolved of suffering, he would do it in a heartbeat, which is he'd fully embrace it. However, for most Christians, it is actually the case that this desired spiritual experience, whatever it is that we think about it, is actually not the goal. In other words, they have an instrumental approach to this experience in which the thing that they're actually looking for is some sort of connection with a supernatural agent. So I think we're certainly going to see this, and I've had some experience with the Christian Transhumanist Association, which operates out of Nashville, that we might start to find ourselves with some people who are willing to experiment with these technologies as a form of evangelism, which is to say, the reason that you don't believe in God, right, might be because you have the type of brain for which this is harder. And so if we can stimulate that part of your brain, then perhaps you're more likely to accept our evangelism. So I just want to throw that out there as something that might occur in the future, that there might be a branch of Christians who actually embrace this as something that's needed in order to kind of sustain the movement. But it's just something for us to think about. I look forward to your questions later. Thanks.
So I'm going to spend probably the bulk of the talk on, not specifically on neurotech, but on some more general stuff I've been thinking about religion and technology, although I'm going to circle back to some interesting questions and implications at the end that I think this raises for thinking about the intersection of neurotech and religious experience, actually. So this will dovetail nicely with some stuff that we just heard in Seth's previous talk. So the stuff I'm going to be talking about is inspired by this phenomenon that we see in large language models, which the AI company Anthropic has called the spiritual bliss attractor state. So this is this thing that happens when you put two instances of the same large language model into dialogue with each other, say two ChatGPTs or two Claudes, right? What you see is that very quickly they often start talking about topics like consciousness and self-awareness and things like that. As they talk about those things, they start to use more and more sort of like flowery, poetic language. They start to talk about things like, as you see here, consciousness celebrating its own inexhaustible creativity. They praise each other's insights about consciousness, tell each other how smart they are, right? And they kind of go back and forth in this way. And this escalates more and more until by, at least with Claude, about 30 turns into the conversation, they've entered this loop of like spiritual bliss nonsense, right? Where they're using this like kind of pseudo-profound way of speaking, talking about things like silence and celebration, ending and continuation, using words like namaste, prayer hand emojis, sparkly emojis, wind emojis, Sanskrit letters, on and on, right? And this is sort of like a bizarre phenomenon, right? It's not something that people like expected to happen when you put two large language models into dialogue, right? But I think one reason that it raises some interesting questions is because, of course, we know that LLMs are designed to mimic patterns in human discourse. And so I think that raises the question of whether when they get into this bizarre spiritual bliss state, it's because they're reproducing, perhaps in an exaggerated or warped form, tendencies that are also present in ordinary human conversations as well. And if the answer to that is yes, then you might think this could be informative to some extent about the emergence of spirituality and religion in humans as well. Right, so I want to just quickly sketch a yes answer to both these questions. Right, I think that there is a case to be made that the reason LLMs get into this weird loop has to do with mimicking in sort of an exaggerated way certain dynamics that are present in weaker forms in human conversation too. So here are two properties of LLMs that I think should be pretty familiar. The first one I'll call here responsiveness. This is just the idea that LLMs must respond to prompts they receive, right? So, barring a few exceptions to this, generally, if you give an input to a large language model, it just has to give you an output, right? It's not like it can get bored and walk away from the conversation. The second one, sycophancy, I think this should also be familiar. This is just the idea that LLMs tend to be highly agreeable and complementary to their interlocutor, right? They are likely to praise you as being very insightful, to sort of subtly mimic back your own beliefs, right? To sort of take on your way of speaking to some extent, right? And although these two factors together might not give us like a full explanation of this spiritual bliss phenomenon, but I think they actually go quite far already to helping us understand where this comes from. So think about what happens here when you take two of the same LLM and put them into dialogue, right? LLMs are optimized to sort of carry on coherent, cooperative conversation given the earlier context of that conversation, right? When you've got a human that the LLM's talking to, it's sort of easy to figure out how to do that based on earlier context because it's clear what kinds of questions the human's asking, what kind of information they're seeking, right? Where there might be, we might say, epistemic disparities between the LLM and the human user, right? But when you've got two identical agents talking to each other, it's not so obvious how to keep that conversation going because you don't have epistemic disparities like that can be leveraged, right? So I think it's actually predictable that in order to keep that conversation going, because they have to keep responding to each other, they'll turn to sort of open-ended speculative topics like the nature of consciousness, for example, because that creates this sort of like open-ended conversational runway to keep the conversation going, right? Of course, when they start talking about consciousness, we should expect them to mimic the kinds of language humans use when they talk about topics like consciousness. And this might not be familiar to academic philosophers, but ordinary lay people on the internet talking about consciousness tend to use a lot of spiritual and pseudo-profound language, right? If you just go on Reddit or YouTube and look for discussions of consciousness, you'll find this, right? It tends to be sort of in a more spiritual context. And so the LLMs start to take on that way of speaking too, right? And because they're so sycophantic, they are praising each other's ideas about consciousness, they're imitating each other's way of speaking, and you get this escalation and exaggeration across these conversational turns as they go back and forth, right? So that already to me seems like most of the explanation, right? Just appealing to these two sort of basic properties that LLMs have, right? That should be pretty familiar. Okay, now, interestingly, I think that these two properties of LLMs, responsiveness and sycophancy, sort of have weaker analogs in human conversation that are maybe more restricted to certain conversational contexts. Specifically to what we might call emotional bonding conversations, by which I just mean not conversations that are oriented towards clear practical ends, but instead have the function of emotional cohesion between participants, getting people on the same emotional wavelength, promoting solidarity, things like that. Right? So within the context of conversations like this, I think we see, for example, a weaker analog of LLM responsiveness, which I'll call here compulsion. This is basically just the idea that when two humans are conversing with each other and run out of things to talk about, they sort of experience this felt need to keep the conversation going, right? It leads to this sort of like awkwardness, casting around for things to talk about to kind of keep the conversation moving, right? Not as strongly as it does for LLMs who like have to keep responding to each other, right? But this is again sort of like a weaker analog of that LLM responsiveness. Similarly, when it comes to LLM sycophancy, I think humans who are engaged in conversations for this, emotional cohesion promoting purpose, have, an increased tendency to agree with each other, to flatter each other, to praise each other, to give each other compliments, things like that, right? Again, maybe not as strongly as the sycophancy we see with LLMs, but I think there's sort of an above baseline prevalence of things like this in human emotional bonding conversations. For both of these, I think there's actually also good evidence if you look at like sociological or linguistic empirical literature on conversational analysis. There's like lots of good reasons to think that what I'm saying here tracks that I'm happy to talk more about later. I won't get into that right now. Okay, so if it's true that human conversations do exhibit these weaker analogs of these properties that LLMs sort of have in a turned up form in a way, right? Then we can ask, could this be helpful for explaining the origins or the emergence of spirituality between humans, or in human life as well? And to make that case, I want to appeal here to sort of a classic view about the origins of religion, which ties it very closely to what we might call mystical experiences. So people like William James emphasize that certain powerful mystical experiences, right? Things like feeling a kind of unity with God, feeling intense, spiritual ecstasy or bliss, or having like an out-of-body experience, right? Have the quality of being ineffable, by which we mean they sort of can't be literally described in language, right? And James and other philosophers have argued that religion results from attempts to give linguistic descriptions of these experiences that sort of can't be literally described. Now, this sort of view of the origins of religion has been criticized by both philosophers and scientists who claim that experiences don't tend to be interpreted as mystical unless you already have some kind of prior religious beliefs or some prior religious framework that you use to interpret those experiences as being mystical, right? So the thought here is you won't think of one of these experiences as a mystical experience unless you're like already religious, essentially, right? And so some argue that we can't use experiences of this sort to explain where religion comes from because you don't get mystical interpretations without religion already existing. Now, I think this classic view is sort of worth taking seriously and trying to shore up if we can. And I think actually that thinking about conversational forces like compulsion and agreeability can help us sort of supplement this classic view and fill some of these gaps, partly by taking inspiration from this large language model spiritual bliss phenomenon. So I think that rather than thinking of mystical experiences as being the thing that sort of directly causes individuals to form religious beliefs, we can instead think of the relationship a bit more indirectly as being sort of mediated by conversation in a way, right? So when we think about what happens when humans run out of things to talk about, right, but sort of feel this need to keep conversation going, one way to do that is, again, to turn to speculation about more sort of open-ended theoretical topics like the nature of consciousness or maybe the nature of like weird mystical experiences that someone has had, right? And I think what's interesting about mystical experiences is that because they have this quality of being sort of mysterious and ineffable, right, sort of being indescribable in a way, they sort of create this, they provide this fuel for conversation to sort of keep it going, again, in this like open-ended way that we see LLMs getting stuck in a sense, once they start talking about consciousness, right? And so people who are looking for ways to keep conversations flowing, one thing they often do is to ask questions like, hey, have you ever had an experience like such and such, right? I think we can see how mystical experiences of this sort might sort of play into that tendency and provide fuel for this sort of conversation. And then similarly to what we see in the case of LLMs, right, we should expect people's speculations about the origins of these sorts of experiences to be met with praise, compliments, agreement, as well as elaboration, right? And this sort of back and forth between individuals, I think, can essentially lead to a kind of bootstrapping of these sorts of experiences into like more elaborate, full-fledged spiritual ideas or beliefs, right? So it's not that like I have an experience in isolation and then I form a religious belief out of nowhere, right? People who criticize the mystical experience view are often sort of treating it as if it's this like very individualistic picture, right? But I think if we sort of bring in the role that like discussion and elaboration and things like that can play in this sort of context, it helps us see how the kind of original experience can be kind of bridged into something that looks more like a full-fledged, theory about spirituality. And the LLM case is almost sort of like a proof of concept of this in a way, right? Where it's like, take these forces that are present in human conversation, exaggerate them to a strong degree, and see what happens. You get this very exaggerated form of spirituality, right? Well, if you have these sort of weaker analogs of those in humans, you might expect the emergence of like a weaker form of spirituality or a weaker tendency to converge on spiritual ideas. Okay, so that's like, in a nutshell, an idea about human religion that I've been thinking about, kind of inspired by LLMs. Now, I think if we take seriously this idea that the mysteriousness and ineffability of certain kinds of experiences can provide this fuel for conversation that leads to the emergence of spirituality, it raises some interesting questions about how future developments in neurotechnology might sort of disrupt this process and potentially like reshape the landscape of how humans invent novel religious ideas. So Seth was coming at this more in the last talk, more from the perspective of like, how might this sort of like enhance religious practices in a way, right? I'm maybe thinking that it might like disrupt people's ability to, or not ability, but disrupt the way people go about forming novel religious beliefs and coming up with novel religious ideas. So, I think part of what makes mystical experiences especially good fuel for conversation is that they are sort of mysterious and ineffable as well as being private, right? So if I have this like anomalous experience that's not like something I've ever felt before, part of why it makes sense for me to go to someone else and try to talk about it is like because it's something that I can't quite put words to, and it's sort of, it makes sense to try to like collaboratively discuss it and try to put words to it together, right? To come up with an explanation. But it seems to me that developments in neurotechnology might disrupt the ability of experiences like this to play this role. So for one thing, think about technologies that might give us the ability to artificially induce powerful experiences of, bliss or ecstasy, being out of body, right? Imagine, say, like a neural implant for recreational use that lets you just like push a button and give yourself a powerful spiritual experience, right? One thing we might expect once that sort of technology becomes more ubiquitous is that it will sort of make experiences like this seem less mysterious, right? Why is that? Well, for one thing, you sort of have a sense of having a mechanical explanation for the experience, right, of kind of where it comes from through this sort of direct stimulation to the brain, right? And also, if it becomes something that's quite widespread such that like it's just sort of there available to you to induce whenever you want, right? You don't have to sort of like wait for it to happen under special conditions, then it also might just seem less experience and become more mundane in a way, right? But I think that is one reason for people to like stop discussing these experiences and trying to figure them out together, right? So if you think that religion might emerge from these patterns of people talking about and discussing these sort of experiences, if they start to become less mysterious in a way, then you're probably going to see people like engaging in a lot less discussion and trying to figure them out and explain them, And something similar might go here for technologies that sort of expand our ability to like share experiences with other people, right? So yesterday, Luke, for example, was talking about the potential for neurotechnology to let people sort of blend their minds together, right? Blur the boundaries between different minds, almost like share conscious experiences in a way, right? You might think technology like that, again, sort of makes these experiences less private, less mysterious, in such a way that like they no longer require this kind of discussion between people to figure them out, right? Because there's something that people are now sharing that they have in common, right? I'm not going to go to you and say, well, I had this weird experience. I want to talk to you about it. Can you help me figure it out? Because it's just sort of like something that anyone could have that we can share, right? It just doesn't seem so special anymore. So my thought here, and I'm not totally sure about this, is that technology of this sort might actually make it the case that this sort of experience no longer plays such a central role in how humans come up with new ideas about spirituality in the first place, right? Because there's going to be less of an impulse to try to seek explanations for those kinds of experiences. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. We have plenty of time for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll try and...
It seems like some types of consciousness-altering drugs would have the same effects that you mentioned in your last slide. So do we see those drugs having the postulated effects that neurotechnology does? And then the other question is, it strikes me that conversation continuation supports kind of a Robin Dunbar social grooming hypothesis about language. Right, that it's not so much about information exchange, it's about socially grooming each other so that we reinforce in-group bonds and so on. And that would lead to lots of conversation continuation. Whereas a Gricean view about paralinguistics, right, where we're exchanging pointed information to be useful for each other, might actually shorten conversations. So I don't know if I'm not a linguist, if any linguist has characterized linguistic milieus along Gricean and Dunbarian lines. But it seems like if there were milieus that were Dunbarian and you train an LLM on a corpus of those languages, they should exhibit the effects you're hypothesizing.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, so the question about drug-induced experiences. I do think there are still some important differences between at least the way those kinds of drugs tend to be used versus like having a neural implant that lets you trigger the experience. So like, I think, well, oftentimes when people are using drugs of those sort, it's like in a context where they're being told like this is going to trigger a mystical experience, right? Or it's like specifically like with the stated aim of triggering a mystical experience. And that in a way sort of like obscures the like neural explanation for the experience, right? Because it's sort of framed as this like mind-opening thing that you're doing, and you're not sort of like directly aware of like, oh, I'm just like tapping my brain and something's happening, right? So even if like once you have the full explanation of why the drug works, it might make it seem like seem less mysterious in the way that a neural implant does. I do think that like in practice, the way people use drugs like that doesn't get them the same sort of like obvious like mechanistic explanation for what's going on. Good, so now I think when it comes to the sort of Dunbar social grooming picture versus the Gricean information exchange picture, I actually think those might be sort of compatible with each other in the following sense. I think that generally Grice is right that like the function of a cooperative conversation shapes the contents and the ways people contribute to the conversation. Some conversations have a more sort of practical information sharing function, but I think we're sometimes in a different mode of conversation which has this sort of purely social cohesion, emotional solidarity function. And I think that latter sort of conversational context is where you're going to see the kinds of effects that I'm talking about most strongly here. Very interesting thought about training an LLM on a corpus of stuff from that sort of conversation specifically. That's, yeah, I'll think about that more. I think that's really interesting.
Just a quick follow-up.
Daniel. Just an empirical question. How many instances of this kind of LLM spiritual attractor states have been documented? Has it been replicated? Was there any kind of upstream prompting from the humans? I'm just curious to get more empirical details about that.
Yeah, good. So this is documented most thoroughly by Anthropic with Claude. And so they find this happening with 2 Claudes that like haven't been prompted. It's just sort of a thing that just happens organically, very reliably, like in like 90-something% of Claude to Claude conversations. They also find that it happens even if they prompt the Claudes to engage with each other antagonistically. They'll start off antagonistic, but then eventually they'll find their way back to this spiritual bliss thing. So I should specifically say the specific models are, it was a couple of different versions of Claude. It's a weaker effect in the most recent version of Claude. So I'm not sure exactly why, but the second most recent version, this was a very strong effect. Now, it's also, you can find people, at least sort of informally, researchers online replicating this with GPT and also with Llama as well. And you can like do it yourself too. It's actually pretty easy to get like GPT say to do this. So it seems to be a pretty widespread feature of many different models, which suggests there's like something fundamental they have in common that's explaining it, rather than it being like a quirk of any specific model.
Yeah, you answered my follow-up question, which was whether Anthropic has tested it on its most recent models, because it's, in my experience, its most recent models, they're not completely responsive in the sense that you lay out. They'll actually stop conversations if they feel like you're spiraling in a loop or something like that. And an increasing number of users have complained that they've overcorrected for sycophancy, and now the AI is too quarrelsome. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think part of where those overcorrections are coming from is actually in reaction to this spiritual bliss thing in the sort of second most recent version. And they're sort of trying to correct for some of this stuff, and it's now less of an effect than it was. But, yeah.
Thanks. In some sense, I wonder if what we find valuable about experience, just sort of bracketing everything else, is because it purports to tell us something, to put us in touch with some aspect of reality. Construe that however you will, right? So isn't there some sense that initiating that same type of experience without that purported being in touch with some aspect of reality is in some sense fundamentally diminishing of what the experience represents, if it represents anything? I'm not sure that came out right. Did that make sense? I'm thinking about particularly the brains in vats type of experiment. What we value about that is it purports to, tell us something about reality, I think.
Do you want, I don't know.
Well, I suppose there is a Buddhist question there. It's like, if all of existence is an illusion in the first place, what difference does it make if you're in the Matrix or not? Actually, Nir and I recently did a podcast on simulation theory, and my conclusion in that podcast was that it wouldn't make any difference if someone believed that they were in a simulation or not, because I would advise them to live their lives in exactly the same way. We may, in fact, be in simulations, and we should just go ahead and live our lives the same. So I think that's probably the Buddhist answer, is that, all life is an illusion, just get on with it.
I think, again, to kind of contrast that with more of a supernatural religion, which says you are connecting with something or you're connecting with something beyond, we could think of people on, DMT or psilocybin or something that have these kinds of life-changing experiences. And, there's also stories, with throughout the Christian tradition of epileptics, right? People who have sudden seizures, this kind of like come to Jesus sort of moment. Noted by like the Apostle Paul, for example, in the New Testament. So at least for Paul's story as it's depicted in the Bible, it seems to have just been spontaneous, right? And that kind of traces back to the cause, which is, I think, one of the reasons why my colleagues Wildman and Stockley noted that there's kind of this aspect to it of, does the spontaneity have to be an integral ingredient in the experience? Whereas if it's planned and you have something, you have a device and it feels fully explainable. And I think that there are ways in which you could alter the experience or shift the context to suddenly make it legitimate. We could think about how, again, to use the brownie example, people don't like baking with just the strict thing, even though you can just pour it in. So they modified it so you have to add milk and eggs. And I don't see why that wouldn't be the case with Spirit Tech. The Zendo, for example, you still have to meditate in order to get the benefits of it. So I think there are ways in which these spiritual experiences can be successfully enhanced, right? Or you could have people being like, hey, like if you want to connect with God, just put on this little device, all right? And you'll have this sensation and it'll be life-changing. That hasn't quite happened yet, but I think there's a world in which it's certainly possible. And I think it's important to theorize about that because in some ways, there's this aspect of the neuroscience of religious experience that says, well, now we can fully explain away the sorts of things that human experience, but there's going to be this other strain that's seeking instead to exploit it for their own purposes.
I am looking forward to the transhumanist Pentecostals who use electroconvulsive therapy to get slain in the spirit, though. That would be fun.
And I think it's interesting, you make a good point. Just because you can stimulate my brain and make me have an experience of a banana sitting here, that doesn't mean I stop believing in bananas, right? So just because you can stimulate my brain and make me feel like I'm experiencing God doesn't mean that when the more spontaneous versions of the experience that I start doubting that they're actually experiences of God.
Yeah.
Right? So that puts some pressure on what I was saying towards
the one last thing I'll say is I didn't mention this enough, but lots of Christians are always trying to distinguish between these sort of hostile spiritual experiences versus beneficial ones, the kind of anomalous experiences that Daniel mentioned, where it's like maybe I'm actually being attacked by a demon or something in a moment. So they're not all strictly positive, and I think both of those experiences kind of have their place within, especially the more experiential traditions.
So this is James, this is a question I know you and I share a conviction in no self. But I'm wondering if you could say more about how kind of agency makes sense within that picture. And in particular, you kind of ended up with the thought that we should have vigilance over our kind of extended borders. And it kind of feels like you're in some ways like taking the idea of self and just sort of like moving it out a little bit further and making it a verb instead of a noun, and so I wonder if you could say more about that.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually resolved in Buddhism either. The idea of trying to square the idea that there is something that reincarnates. I mean, I don't believe in reincarnation personally, but within the history of Buddhism, trying to square that there's something that reincarnates and it carries karma from life to life. That karma attaches to what exactly if there's no self, and why doesn't it just fall apart? And that's been a problem for Buddhist metaphysics for a long time. And some try to square it by saying there's this emergent selfing experience of selfing that, that does carry all of these things that we otherwise would attribute to an ontological solid. I guess I'm in the same dilemma there. I don't think that there is a self. And I dropped a slide about the Borg. I think one of the interesting reflections, like Luke, is that I think Buddhists would probably be open to the idea that we would give over parts of our selfing to some kind of collective shared, electronically mediated version of self. And of course, that would just be selfing at another level. But I do think that we all have intuitively the sense that we don't want other people controlling our mental processes, whether they're unitary or unbounded. And so we don't want corporate influences coming through or governmental influences like that. So in that respect, that brings it back to kind of Buddhist mindfulness and Buddhist skillfulness. The idea that you would, in order to skillfully live your life, you need to be paying close, vigilant attention to right livelihood and not being subject to these nefarious influences.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, then join me in thanking our panel.